Welcome everybody to the show. We are going to be trying something a little new, giving you a little bit of updates here. One of the things we're going to start doing is I have a podcast that goes live every Friday. And one of the things I'm going to try doing is going live here on Mondays with what we're going to be talking about on that podcast. And so if you are able to join us live, that's great. And we can answer some of your questions. And also if you are, not able to stay for the whole time, you can catch the rest of this too on Fridays for the podcast. So welcome. Today, what we are going to talk about is a couple of different things. We're going to talk about the fourth discipline in triathlon, which is nutrition. And we're going to talk about some of the frustrations that can come around that. But first, I wanted to get to some updates as far as what's going on in this world here. So one of the things that's coming up that I wanted to let you know about is that there is a webinar coming up on April 22nd, and we are going to be covering GI related things in triathlon and endurance sports and just sports in general, and where nutrition and fueling can be very, very effective at either hurting your gut or helping it. So that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about on that webinar. Another thing we're going to be talking about is if you are struggling with like finding time for nutrition and health, we're going to be talking about some things that can be very, very helpful for helping you spend the time on your nutrition and health, especially as it comes to your performance. And then the other thing we're going to be talking about as well is something that has become a little bit more common for you to hear about is this joining of performance and health at the same time. So essentially what we want to try to see is this bridging this gap between the fit and sort of fatigued athlete and bringing them to this fit and healthy elite athlete place, making that transformation, making that transition. This is one of the things we're going to be covering in that webinar. So that's coming up on April 22nd. So make sure you are looking out for that. Okay. So as we get into today's episode, and what we're going to be, you might see me, for those of you that are actually watching this live or on the video for YouTube, I may be kind of looking around, and that's because I've got a couple of different cameras and things happening here. So bear with me. One of the things I wanted to talk about is especially, so if you are an athlete, if you identify in any sort of sense with that word, being an athlete, then you likely have at least one goal, which is to perform well, right? I mean, there's many different reasons why we do that, but why we do sports and why we do triathlon or different types of fitnessy type things. And most of the time that's because, and we have a goal of, we want to perform well. It could be that you also want to stay healthy and it's your way of staying healthy. There's a lot of different reasons why people play sports and continue to do sports, beyond just, when they were a kid. But most of the time when you are training for something specific, there is a piece of that, which is that you just want to perform well. You want to perform at your best. And we're always sort of chasing that really great race or that really great event or that next PR, seeing how far we can push our boundaries, right? Also, another goal too is to try to perform injury-free as much as we possibly can, or as pain-free as possible. The other thing that I often see a lot of as well is that it's this desire to not just feel good and perform well, but also in many ways to feel healthy. And encompassed around that is wanting to achieve those personal best goals. The thing, though, where I think a lot of people get a little bit caught up is that they start to focus only on their training because that's where it seems like you're going to get the most impact, right? It's like, okay, so I'm going to take on a 5K, or I'm going to take on a small sprint triathlon, or I'm going to take on an Ironman. So what do I need to do? Couch to 5K or couch to Ironman. I either need to get a training program, I need to hire a coach, or I need to just get myself moving. I need to get myself out the door. And you focus a lot on the training piece. But what's interesting is that if you actually start to look at where a lot of the benefits come from training, it's all the stuff that you do outside of training. So it's that Um, it's the recovery, it's the rest, it's the nutrition, it's figuring out some of these pieces, which for the most part are things that people have a tendency to ignore or get extremely confused about. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to work on today. And there's a couple of reasons why people have a tendency to athletes have a tendency to sort of ignore this, or they have a tendency to um, just get confused around it. And some of it can actually be rooted in a few beliefs. And those are some things that I wanted to talk about today. So number one, I think one of the biggest areas where we see a really large, I would call it a limiting belief in a sense, is thinking I don't have time to work on my nutrition and my health. And to that, I would say, have you ever considered what happens if you don't work on your nutrition and your health and those kinds of things, and you just sort of ignore those things and put them off to the side? Have you ever considered what happens then when you don't do that, and then you don't end up reaching those goals when you get injured? In that sense, and this is one of the things that I talk about a lot, isn't that just a ton of wasted time and effort? Because one of the things that we can do is we can leverage the things that you do, right? We can leverage your performance in your training, but we can also leverage your nutrition. We can also leverage and use inflammation to help us. And we can also take advantage of the time that you're spending in training to get the most benefit out of it, right? It doesn't always, like, if you were to think about it, so for a triathlete, for example, especially if you're going for an Ironman, a lot of Ironman athletes are training at least 10 hours a week, but most likely more than that. So in that 10 plus hours a week, that's a lot of time spent training. And one of the things that I ask my athletes in my office is, if you're spending all of that time training, wouldn't it be nice if you could actually get the most out of that time that you're spending training, right? It's kind of a no-brainer, but in the same sense, like, would you be saying that you don't necessarily have time for your nutrition and your health if you achieved your personal best? So when I hear that kind of like, yes, I know that I need to be working on nutrition and health, but I don't really have the time to do it. One of the things, and I get that, right? Like, I have this business, I'm training for triathlons. I've got, people in my life, family members, people I want to spend time with. It's hard to sometimes, and I'm also a hobby farmer. So I've got lots of things to do, around my property. And it can be really hard to put in the time to, make food and spend time on nutrition. And so, and this is where I think a lot of people get caught up, is like, well, I don't really have the time to meal plan, or I don't really have the time to make all of these meals. And so I'm just going to leave it because it's something that I just can't do. But my question to you in that is, you likely can find the time, but would you be saying that you don't have the time or you can't do that if you actually reached that goal that you're chasing, that personal best, right? Another one that is very common to hear as well out of this is, I can't figure out this fourth discipline. So the fourth discipline in triathlon is known as nutrition. So it's very commonly that you'll hear this like frustrating thing come out of athletes' mouths, especially when they come to see me and they'll say, I just can't figure out the fourth discipline. Like, it's like, I keep bonking, I keep running out of energy, I keep having problems, towards that, end of the race. I keep getting to that, 20th mile, or that 8th mile, depending on which Ironman or different types of triathlons you're doing. And I'm just running out of energy at the end of the race. And the thing about that is, and the question I would ask you, if you are somebody who has thought that, is, what specific part of the fourth discipline can't you figure out? Sometimes all it takes is being aware of some of the patterns that you're doing that may be actually contributing to why you're not able to figure that pattern out. So, or to figure out that fourth discipline or whatever it is that you're struggling with, kind of wrapping your mind around and figuring out a step to move forward in, right? So for example, one might be, and this is just based off of some of the athletes that I've worked with, one is sometimes it actually is rooted in the types of fuel sources that you're using and consuming. So for example, one could be gels, one could be whole foods, one could be actually like liquid fuels. So like this would be like a very, very dense carbohydrate water bottle, right? So there's a lot of different types of ways that we can fuel for those races and that performance. But one of the things that can cause some issues for some people is the type of fuel source that they're using. Okay. Another example of this could be how you are eating prior to your race day. So sometimes athletes aren't using as many carbohydrates as they need to prior to their race day or event day. And then that can lead to issues because they don't have enough energy stored up on race day. Another example would be not eating enough throughout the majority of your training. So you kind of are going into race day already in a somewhat energy deficient or energy low, deficient. What's the other word for that? An energy deficit. That's the word, an energy deficit state. And all of those things can ultimately get you to race day in that energy deficit place, which can then make race day even harder. Okay. And then the third belief that I wanted to cover on this one is that peak performance, achieving that elite peak performance, no matter what level that is for you, means that it's going to come at a sacrifice for your health. And I would say to that, I would say that the biggest thing for that is that most peak performers at the top of their game, if they want to stay there and sustain that for a long period of time, have to focus on their health. And the reason I say that is here's a couple of examples, I think, that probably back that up a little bit better. Number one, if you look at female athletes alone, okay, and the ones who are at an energy deficit, at a food like nutrition deficit for long enough that they end up losing their periods, if you look at how long they're able to sustain any sort of performance in that state, for it oftentimes it depends a lot on the person and on the genetics, but they aren't able to sustain that for very long. Like they might get away with 6 months to a year of fairly high performance, could be 2 years, could be 5 years before they see the body just really start to break down. But my question to you in that is that athlete actually performing as well as they could be if they have lost their period and they are in such an energy deficient state that the body can't even keep up with things that it's supposed to be doing in a well fueled, in a well a happy, healthy state, right? Arguably that athlete could be performing even better if it was eating, if it had enough of that food, right? And had enough of that energy coming in to support what they're doing. The second thing I would say is one of the things you can look at on labs for athletes is a lot of different types of inflammatory markers. And some of them can actually be in the neutrophil and lymphocytes. So like if you've ever looked at your labs that you've had run from your doctor, and you can go into your portals and panels and actually take a look at this, but you can look at for your neutrophils and lymphocytes, and there's a ratio that you can get from those. And one of the things that comes out of that is we can watch as an athlete goes through their season. And if they're kind of in this like lowish to maybe mid-range of that ratio, it's kind of, it's borderline getting a little bit higher, that's all okay. We can manage that. But as soon as that ratio starts to get really, really high, and is very clear that there are some issues there, it doesn't necessarily matter per se if that athlete is, trying to achieve a very peak performance place. one of the things we're going to see very quickly after that point is their performance will start to drop. They will start to get some fatigue. We might start seeing some pain, some injuries, things like that. And my point in all of this is basically to say that there is very much so a balance between when your body is healthy and actually functioning well to when it is starting to break down, because there's not enough stuff coming in to help you keep and sustain that peak performance for a long period of time. And then the other one the other example on this too is this an example of vitamin C deficiency. So one of the things that when I was studying underneath a mentor is I was looking at some labs as an NFL athlete was going through their season, and they started out with fairly decent vitamin C levels. And then as they went through their season, they just dropped and they got lower and lower and lower. And one of the things that this mentor was looking at is, if we supplement with vitamin C, what's the impact of that? Now we know that antioxidants and supplementing with antioxidants in a training season can actually delay your adaptation to exercise. And so we want to be very, very careful about how we put antioxidants into the system. But here's something else that we also need to keep in mind, because this is not just wanting to look at a marker, so like low vitamin C and then put a vitamin C supplement in. That's not the way we want to do things. We want to look at the system as a whole. So yes, that vitamin C is in supplemental form could delay some adaptations to exercise. But if they are very deficient in vitamin C and they get injured, and especially if they have to get surgery, the recovery time post-surgery is longer the more deficient in vitamin C that you are. Versus if that athlete is just doing their best to sort of maintain this borderline solid vitamin C levels and maybe just a little bit deficient, the recovery on the flip side of surgery is actually going to be probably better and faster if they try to maintain some of those levels. So my point to you, if you've ever heard or thought that like peak performance and achieving that ultimate elite level comes at a cost of your health, there is a balance between the two. And especially when I'm working with triathletes and endurance athletes, one of the things that you can see is if this isn't well managed and this isn't well balanced, one of the things that can come out of that is that athlete goes through their season of training and is getting more and more fatigued and more symptomatic and experiencing more and more pain and inflammation the further they get and the closer they get to race day. And then what happens is they're going into race day and they're feeling super fit, but really fatigued and almost to the sense of broken down just by the time they get to race day, which isn't a very good place to be, right? Like what we want to see is that athlete thriving throughout their season so that when they get to race day, they are just like, they get their shoes on and they're just like ready to go, right? So there's my point in all of this is that there is a balance. There's a place for both of these, and how we establish that and how we balance that has to come from in some way from nutrition. It has to come in some way from spending time in recovery and rest and optimizing sleep and optimizing also like your fueling and nutrition around not just your day, but also around your performance and your training too. So I think also too, in this is that there's a lot of beliefs or there's a lot of misconceptions around nutrition that comes from the fact that the internet has a lot of information out there that may or may not it may be backed by science and it may be backed by research. But when you look at it from like a systems approach and looking at a function of how the body functions with that, then, you start to get kind of a different picture. Here's an example of what I mean by that. When we look at, okay, so I want you to think about this in the perspective of there's a lot of information out there that's like, hey, let's work on testing. This is true, but let's work on testing your fuel sources before race day so that we can get your gut used to whatever it is that you're wanting to use, which is a very good thing to do. And it's something, and strategies for fueling and for your race day or for your competitions is actually extremely important. And you should be doing that long before you get close to race day. You should also be doing that for your hydration strategy and all of that. But one of the things that can happen is, depending on what type of fuel source you choose. So if it's like a very fast sugar, so like candies, things like that, just basically straight up glucose or sucrose, it can change the type of bacteria that are in your gut, that can then lead to an increase in inflammation and potentially lead to things like reducing your resistance to fatigue. So one of the things we want to do is we want to be very careful as far as what we're using throughout training and on race day, and be very specific about what we choose. Now, what you will hear though in the industry is that nutrition and fueling and fuel sources, if you get GI distress, it's probably because you didn't test that well enough. Or you might hear that, oh, well, then you just need to choose a different fuel source. But what I'm saying is that if you pay attention to how the gut functions, and then you also are prioritizing making sure you're getting certain gut supportive foods and things like that throughout the rest of your day and throughout the rest of your week, you can balance out a lot of those high sugars and some of those fuel sources, and make sure that you're actually supporting your body through the entire system so that it functions really well, so that you're not ending up with a lot of inflammation that then creates issues for your immune system. And that you're also getting a lot of different types of fibers and foods into your gut, as well as cultured and fermented foods into your gut that support the bacteria there, which can then help out your mitochondria, which create energy, as well as help out that your muscles in improving their resistance to fatigue. Meaning, those are all a lot of words just to basically say that as you get later and later into your race day, you have high levels of energy, right? And so you don't see a lot of that drop into, or the increase in time in your numbers as you get closer and closer to the finish line. So that is just basically where I want to wrap this up. There is a lot of information out there about what you should be doing. And then I think a lot of that can end up leading to a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted money as well. So part of what I want to do with these episodes is help you be able to determine what the best things are for you to be doing to help you perform well, to help you achieve a personal best if that's something that you're chasing, to be able to race without pain and without injuries as much as possible, and also to be able to just dial in your performance and your health. So if that's something that you would find really interesting, and if you go back and you listen to the beginning of this episode and you are interested in joining me for the webinar, one of the best ways that you can hear about it when it goes live, because we'll be starting to put the link out there and all of that, is to go to drkirsten.com/finish strong. And I'll put the link in the comments and in the show notes. But at there, what you'll get is a guide that I created that basically helps you to put together some of these foundational pillars, as far as making sure you have optimal gut health, as far as making sure you have optimal nutrition and are sort of fighting and preventing those micronutrient deficiencies and some of those areas of nutrition where a lot of athletes have a tendency to kind of fall off. We'll also talk about inflammation and what ways you leverage inflammation to help you perform really well, but also what ways we can use food and nutrition to help mop up some of that inflammation so that you get the most out of the adaptations to your training and to your exercise, but not so much to the point that it ends up putting you into that like overtraining, fatigued, broken down state. So if you'd like to grab that guide that I created for you, that's at drkirsten.com/finish strong. And that's it. So thank you so much for joining me today. If you are wanting to catch the replay of this, as I mentioned, you can head to on Friday. This whole thing will be live up on the podcast at the Fit and Healthy Elite Athlete podcast. So you can check that out there as well. So take care. Have a great day. And I will see you all next week.